What if everything you thought you knew about justice, bravery, and the invisible lines that divide us was turned on its head in a single heartbeat? Today, you'll hear a tale that might just rock your faith in what is fair. When a courageous black man stepped in to save the life of a Chicago police officer, he expected perhaps a handshake, maybe a thank you, but he got so much more than he bargained for. In these next moments, you'll discover the extraordinary chain of events that followed one selfless act, and the shocking aftermath that not even the bravest heart could anticipate. Terence Brown had always believed in doing the right thing, even when life hadn't always rewarded him for it. Growing up on the south side of Chicago, he'd seen firsthand the complexities of law enforcement, racial tension, and economic hardship. It was a backdrop that forced many to become cynical, but not Terence. Even in his darkest days, he held on to a flicker of hope that there was still goodness to be found in the world if only one had the courage to search for it. He lived in a modest studio apartment in a rundown complex on East 79th Street, just a few miles away from the hustle of downtown Chicago. It wasn't the dream home he'd often pictured: white picket fence, lush lawn, a dog frolicking in the yard, but it was his reality. He made do by working nights at the local shipping warehouse and occasionally helping out at a nearby community center, talking to youths about staying out of trouble and focusing on their future. His own father had been absent when Terence was young, so he knew the difference a single adult male role model could make in a child's life. Despite several incidents in his childhood that had left him wary of police unfair stops, abrupt interrogations, Terence had never succumbed to hatred or bitterness. He believed in individuals, not uniforms. And so it was on a cool September evening, as he was walking home from picking up dinner from a local pizzeria, that Terence's convictions and character would face the ultimate test. He heard gunshots ricochet through the quiet street. Instinctively, he ducked behind the nearest parked car, heart pounding in his chest. He debated what to do next. Should he run for cover? Call the police? Risk looking for someone in trouble? As he hesitated, another round of shots rang out, dangerously close. Adrenaline surged through his veins, overshadowing fear with an immediate sense of urgency. Someone was in danger. He couldn't just stand by. Cautiously, Terence crept along the rows of parked cars until he reached the entrance to a narrow alley. The yellow street lamps flickered overhead, casting ominous shadows on the pavement. And then he saw it. A police cruiser parked at a skewed angle, its lights off, like it had been ambushed. Just a few feet away, he spotted a police officer slumped against the wall. Terence froze as dread filled his mind. Had the officer been shot? Was the shooter still around? He crouched down beside the wounded cop. The man was conscious, but bleeding heavily from his shoulder, his face twisted in pain. Terence recognized the badge pinned to his uniform: Officer Daniel Carter, Chicago Police Department. Terence hadn't known Carter personally, but he recalled seeing that name somewhere, perhaps in a local news article lauding a recent gang bust. The officer's eyes fluttered open, filled with desperation and agony. "Help me," Officer Carter managed to whisper, his voice strained. Dark red blood seeped through his uniform. Terence pressed a hand over the bullet wound, trying to stem the bleeding, his heart hammering. The logic was simple. If he didn't act fast, the man could bleed out on the spot. What came next was pure muscle memory from a first aid course Terence had taken years ago. His calloused hands, used to lifting boxes and coaching basketball drills for kids at the community center, worked methodically. He tore a piece of the officer's uniform to make a makeshift bandage, applied pressure, and kept speaking calmly to the wounded man, telling him to breathe, to stay awake, to focus on anything but the pain. It felt like hours, but in reality, it was only a few minutes before backup arrived, sirens screaming through the night. Half a dozen officers rushed into the alley, weapons drawn, flashlights slicing through the darkness. Terence raised his hands, praying they wouldn't mistake him for the shooter, that they wouldn't see only a suspect in the black man kneeling over an injured cop. "Don't move!" one of the officers shouted. Terence obeyed, slowly standing with his hands in the air. "It's not me," Terence yelled, voice trembling. "He's been shot. I've been helping him." Officer Carter, still conscious, rasped a few words in support of Terence, and two of the arriving officers rushed forward to check on their fallen comrade. Another approached Terence, pinned him against the wall, patted him down, and demanded an explanation. In those tense moments, Terence felt his life teeter on the brink of a single misunderstanding. But as soon as the cops realized Terence wasn't armed and that he'd just saved one of their own, the mood shifted. The paramedics arrived, quickly loading Officer Carter onto a gurney. He gripped Terence's hand before being wheeled away. Terence remembered the look on Carter's face, a complex mix of gratitude and something else, something Terence couldn't quite label at the time. In the following days, Terence became a reluctant local hero. Neighborhood folks who had once viewed him as just another guy scraping by suddenly called him the man who saved a cop. The community center staff where he volunteered praised him for his bravery. He even got a few phone calls from local newspapers wanting interviews about the incident. Feeling overwhelmed by the attention, Terence turned most of them down. He didn't do it for glory, he'd done it because it was the right thing. One day, though, he received a formal invitation to visit the Chicago Police Department's District 6 precinct, where Carter worked. They wanted to publicly thank him. On a crisp morning a week after the shooting, Terence walked through the heavy glass doors of the District 6 station. The building itself was imposing, a fortress of tan bricks and narrow windows. A large bronze plaque out front read, "Chicago Police Department, to serve and protect." Terence's stomach fluttered with nerves. He wasn't used to standing on the bright side of a police encounter. Inside, to his surprise, he was greeted with polite nods. A young desk clerk guided him to the office of Lieutenant Alvarez, who oversaw this district. Alvarez was a sturdily built man in his 50s, with flecks of grey in his hair and the kind of stern face that, when it broke into a grin, could light up a room. He thanked Terence for his valor, expressing how Carter might have died if Terence hadn't stepped in. But things felt off. Terence noticed how a few officers cast suspicious glances. Some wore forced smiles. He couldn't blame them. Maybe it was caution, or maybe it was the precarious tension that often shadowed interactions between law enforcement and men like him. Lieutenant Alvarez escorted Terence to a small conference room where Officer Carter sat in a wheelchair, a bandage on his shoulder. Seeing the policeman upright and conscious was a relief. Carter's eyes flashed with recognition when Terence entered. He mustered a smile and reached out to shake Terence's hand. "You saved my life," Carter said, his voice quiet. "I can't thank you enough." Terence shrugged politely, suddenly shy. "I just did what anyone should do." Carter's grip on Terence's hand tightened. Not everyone would have, especially not with gunshots in the air. Alvarez cleared his throat and introduced them to a small group of press, city officials, and other officers. There was a brief presentation, a commendation plaque, and polite applause. Most of the officers in the room seemed genuinely grateful, but Terence noticed at least one who stood stiffly in the corner, arms folded, eyes cold as steel, Officer Timothy Swanson. A tall, broad-shouldered man with a persistent frown etched into his features. Even as everyone clapped for Terence, Swanson's face never changed. Later, as Terence was leaving, he locked eyes with Swanson in the hallway. A chill ran up Terence's spine. Swanson turned without a word and disappeared into an office. Despite that uneasy moment, Terence tried to absorb the positivity of the morning. He had done a good thing, and in turn, the majority of the precinct seemed grateful. Maybe it was a sign that bridging gaps was possible, that even in a complex city like Chicago, Moments of shared humanity could triumph, but life's illusions often shatter swiftly. Over the next few days, Terence's phone buzzed with calls from unknown numbers. Some seemed to be local reporters. He turned down interviews, but people were persistent. He tried returning to his old routine, focusing on work at the warehouse and volunteering at the community center. However, each night when he came home, there were half a dozen voice messages from numbers he didn't recognize. Rumors swirled that Carter's shooter was still at large, a suspected gang member named Miguel Ruiz. People wondered if Terence had seen him. Did Terence know more than he was letting on? 1 week after the ceremony, Terence found a note stuck to his apartment door. It read, "Snitches get stitches." A sense of dread gnawed at him. He'd never belonged to any gang, never engaged in the drug trade. Why would someone threaten him? Uncertain and afraid, he tucked the note away and tried to refocus on normalcy. Then, on a Friday night, Terence was about to leave for his night shift. He descended the stairs of his apartment building, only to find 3 men blocking his path in the dimly lit stairwell. They wore black hoodies and had their faces partially covered with bandanas. One of them grabbed Terence by the collar, slamming him against the wall. "You think you're a hero?" One hissed, breath hot with the stench of cigarettes. "Going around saving cops?" Before Terence could respond, another man swung a punch that caught Terence's jaw. Pain exploded across his face. His body automatically tensed, bracing for the worst. The first man grabbed Terence's shirt, glaring at him with furious eyes. "You don't talk to the police, you don't help them. If we find out you said anything else, you won't be walking away," he snarled. With a quick shove, they sent Terence sprawling on the steps. The trio hurried off into the darkness. Terence sat there, breathless, stunned, trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. He was in pain, but more than that, he felt betrayed by a world where doing good came at such a high cost. That night, Terence filed a police report. The responding officers seemed indifferent, merely jotting down his statement and leaving with no promise of swift follow-up. He didn't hear from them again. Exhausted, Terence considered going to the station and talking directly to Carter or Lieutenant Alvarez. But an unexpected phone call changed his plan. "Terence Brown," came a gravelly voice on the other end. "This is Officer Timothy Swanson, District 6. We have some questions about your connection to the shooting." Terence's heart pounded. Swanson? The same officer who had glared daggers at him during the ceremony. Why would he be calling now? "I don't have any connection," Terence replied tersely. "I just happened to be there. I saved Carter's life, remember?" Swanson's tone dripped with condescension. "We've got intel that suggests the shooter might have ties to your community center. We need you to come in for questioning." Alarm bells went off in Terence's mind. The community center was largely populated by kids trying to stay out of trouble, supervised by staff who believed in second chances. The idea that they'd be connected to a violent shooter felt ludicrous. Yet Terence reluctantly agreed to come in. He knew refusing to cooperate could make things worse. So the next day, Terence found himself back at the District 6 precinct, but this time, the atmosphere was drastically different. No welcoming committee, no commendations. A pair of cold eyes watched him from behind a metal desk in an interrogation room. Swanson motioned for him to sit. "Tell me about Miguel Ruiz," Swanson demanded, leaning forward with an air of intimidation. Terence shrugged. "Never met him. Didn't even see his face. The night it happened, I heard gunshots and found Carter in the alley. That's it." Swanson crossed his arms, leaning back. "You know, heroes come in all shapes, but so do liars. People on the street talk. I'm hearing you got ties with local gangs." Terence's voice rose, cracking with indignation. "Ties? I volunteer at a community center, trying to keep kids away from gangs. You can check my record. I've never been part of any gang." A flicker of annoyance crossed Swanson's face, but he kept pressing. "So how do you know Carter was shot? Maybe it was planned. Maybe you were involved." Terence felt a tightness in his chest. "Are you accusing me of setting this up? That's insane. If I was involved, why would I risk my life to save him?" Swanson smirked. "Sometimes criminals stage heroics to divert attention from themselves. Maybe you wanted to get on our good side, so you pretended to be the hero." Terence's fists clenched, anger raging inside him. "This is ridiculous. I have no reason to shoot an officer." The interrogation continued for hours, with Swanson hurling accusations. His questions were invasive, dredging up Terence's financial hardships, implying that maybe he was paid to orchestrate some elaborate setup. When Terence mentioned the note on his door and the stairwell attack, Swanson shrugged dismissively. "Could be your own people warning you not to squeal," he said. By the time Terence was finally allowed to leave, he was exhausted, humiliated, and furious. He found comfort only in the fact that Carter might set the record straight. If anyone knew Terence was innocent, it was the man whose life he'd saved. But Carter was still on medical leave, recovering at home. In the following weeks, Terence's life spiraled. He suffered sleepless nights, half expecting another attack in his apartment. The community center staff grew worried about him. He'd show up with bruises or looking over his shoulder. Financial stress mounted as he'd used up his sick days dealing with police visits and bruised ribs. The local press had died down in their interest. All that remained was a sense of suspicion swirling around Terence. Finally, a small ray of hope emerged. Carter called Terence personally. His voice over the phone was strained but apologetic. He'd heard from Lieutenant Alvarez about Swanson's investigation and was disgusted by it. "I'm sorry," Carter said, sighing. "Swanson isn't a bad cop, but he's stubborn and sometimes sees conspiracies everywhere. I told him you were the one who saved me. Plain and simple. But he's following some intel from a detective. They found bullet casings that didn't match the ones from my gun or from the suspected gang member." Terence sighed. "So that means what?" Carter hesitated. "Swanson thinks there was a third party involved. He's convinced you know more than you're saying." "Unbelievable," Terence muttered. "He's trying to pin me as some mastermind?" "I'm going to talk to Alvarez," Carter promised. "This has gone too far. Give me a little time." "I'll vouch for you." Terence hung up, feeling a fleeting sense of relief. Maybe, just maybe, Carter would clear his name from the swirling suspicion. Days passed, and true to his word, Carter tried to intervene. He filed reports attesting that Terence had no involvement with the shooting. He told Internal Affairs that without Terence's intervention, he might be dead. Yet the tide didn't shift entirely. There were still whisperings in the station that Terence might have ties to the shooter. Someone from the community center might have recognized him from the night in the alley. Rumor had it that Terence and the suspect had once attended the same high school. The speculation grew more and more far-fetched. And so a bizarre, twisted scenario took shape. The man who saved a cop's life was slowly being branded a possible suspect. But that wasn't even the worst part. One Friday evening, Terence went to the community center for a youth workshop. As he was exiting, 2 police cruisers roared up, lights flashing. Out stepped Swanson, along with 2 uniformed officers, marching straight toward Terence with purpose. Onlookers froze in silence as Terence was handcuffed in front of the wide-eyed kids. "What are you doing?" Terence demanded, panic flaring. "I haven't done anything." Swanson's eyes burned with self-righteous conviction. "Terence Brown, you're under arrest for interfering with a police investigation and withholding evidence." Gasps rippled through the small crowd. Some kids started crying. Others pulled out their phones, filming the entire ordeal. "You have the right to remain silent," Swanson recited as Terence's mind reeled with disbelief. He'd done nothing. What evidence could he possibly be withholding? Swanson insisted Terence had refused multiple requests to reveal the identity of the shooter, but Terence had never had such information to begin with. As they shoved Terence into the back of the squad car, reality struck him like a heavy blow. He was in serious trouble, all because he tried to do the right thing. The next 72 hours were a nightmare. Locked in a holding cell, Terence endured the humiliation of pat-downs, suspicious glares from officers who assumed he was guilty, and restless nights listening to the chaos of other inmates. With no resources for a lawyer, Terence languished in confusion, wondering how his life had taken such a horrific turn. A glimmer of hope emerged when Carter visited him. The officer looked pale and fatigued, but his face showed genuine sorrow. "I'm sorry, man," Carter said quietly, leaning against the barred door. "This is insane. I'm trying to pull strings to get you out of here. Why do they think I'm withholding evidence?" Terence asked, voice trembling. "It's a lie." Carter ran a hand through his hair, wincing from his shoulder wound. "Swanson claims to have an eyewitness who places you with Miguel Ruiz the night before the shooting. He's convinced you're protecting someone." Terence felt his stomach drop. "That's impossible. The night before the shooting, I was at the warehouse. I can get timesheets." "I know," Carter assured him. "We'll get this sorted." Despite Carter's promise, it took 3 agonizing days for Terence's timesheet to be verified. Eventually, a quiet judge released him pending investigation, concluding that there was no probable cause to keep him detained. Terence walked out of the station with Carter, both men exhausted. But the damage had been done. Word spread that Terence had been arrested. People whispered. Some of his neighbors eyed him with suspicion. Rumors overshadowed the fact that he was the Good Samaritan who had saved Carter's life. At the shipping warehouse, Terence's boss told him to take some unpaid leave until this all blows over. Bills piled up, stress soared. Yet, if the city's rumor mill was a storm cloud, a single silver lining appeared. Local journalist Denise Parker from the Chicago Tribune got wind of Terence's predicament and decided to pursue the story. She reached out to Terence, who initially hesitated, but eventually agreed to talk. He had nothing to lose. Denise was a relentless reporter, with a reputation for exposing injustice. She spent hours interviewing Terence, documenting his background, verifying his community center involvement, and investigating his arrest. She also interviewed Carter, who wholeheartedly defended Terence's character. Denise's hunch was clear. Terence Brown was being railroaded by a faction of the Chicago PD that couldn't admit they had no solid leads on the actual shooter. But as she dug deeper, Denise uncovered a troubling piece of information. Officer Swanson had a history of questionable arrests and was under internal scrutiny for racial profiling allegations. Several misconduct complaints had been filed against him, though never substantiated enough to result in termination. Denise believed Swanson might be targeting Terence to deflect attention from his own failures. When Denise confronted Swanson at the precinct parking lot, microphone in hand, camera rolling, Swanson stonewalled her. "No comment," he barked, stalking away. The brief footage only fueled public speculation. The story Denise published was a bombshell, hero or suspect. The troubled case of Terence Brown. It highlighted the absurdity of Terence's predicament. A man lauded for saving a cop's life, now being treated like a criminal without solid evidence. Within days, public outcry erupted on social media. The hashtag #FreeTerence trended locally. Community organizations rallied in his defense, staging peaceful protests outside the precinct. While Terence was grateful for the growing support, he still felt anxious and vulnerable. The rumor of him being connected to a dangerous shooter could trigger more threats. The men who attacked him in the stairwell had never been caught. At least now, he found some solace in the knowledge that the public eye was watching. The police couldn't simply make him disappear. Pressure mounted on Lieutenant Alvarez and the CPD leadership. Alvarez, who had once praised Terence for his bravery, found himself between a rock and a hard place. The official stance was that every lead must be investigated, including Terence's potential connection. But privately, Alvarez admitted the entire situation reeked of a scapegoat scenario. Carter, still on medical leave, kept demanding that his colleagues drop this baseless pursuit. Yet a handful of officers, led by Swanson, persisted in spinning theories that Terence was involved. Finally, Internal Affairs stepped in, launching a formal inquiry into Swanson's conduct. Even more press attention followed, and for a moment it seemed like Terence might find vindication. But fate is rarely straightforward. On a particularly grey afternoon, Carter called Terence with alarming news. The real shooter, Miguel Ruiz, had been killed in a gang shootout on the west side. The police had confirmed his identity through ballistics on a separate homicide. That same day, rumors circulated that the ballistic evidence from Carter's shooting indeed matched the weapon found near Ruiz's body. In other words, Terence had absolutely nothing to do with it. You might think this would instantly clear Terence, but that's when the final twist-hard karma, so to speak, reared its head. The same day Miguel Ruiz's death hit the news, a large stash of narcotics was uncovered in an abandoned building near Terence's apartment. Officer Swanson, desperate to save face, pointed to an unsealed box with Terence's name scrawled on it, an old shipping box that had somehow ended up in the building. Swanson used it to claim Terence was involved in narcotics distribution, casting yet another shadow over his name. If Terence had been set up before, this felt like the finishing blow. In truth, that shipping box had once belonged to Terence's neighbor, who had asked him to hold on to some personal items months ago. Terence had scribbled his name on the box so they wouldn't mix belongings. The neighbor had moved away abruptly, and the box disappeared from Terence's small storage area not long after. Now, unbelievably, it was found in a drug den. Swanson seized on it, calling Terence in for questioning yet again. This time, Terence refused to go alone. With Denise Parker's help, he secured a volunteer attorney from a local civil rights group. They marched into the station, demanding to see the evidence. The tension was palpable. Swanson tried to corner Terence in the interrogation room, but the lawyer stepped in, shutting down any intimidation tactics. The new allegations were paper-thin. No direct link existed between Terence and the narcotics. Lieutenant Alvarez finally had enough. He confronted Swanson in front of multiple witnesses, demanding real evidence or an immediate cessation of the harassment. Swanson fumed, accusing Alvarez of going soft, but the tide had turned. Enough had been exposed to reveal Swanson's vendetta. Days later, Swanson was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the Internal Affairs investigation. Charges against Terence were dropped, and though the CPD never formally apologized, the silence spoke volumes. Terence was innocent. After everything, Terence walked out of the precinct a free man, but not the same man who'd first rushed to save Officer Carter's life. He was bruised physically, emotionally, spiritually. He had been targeted, threatened, humiliated, arrested, nearly framed. Yet, ironically, he still didn't regret saving Carter. It wasn't Carter who had done him wrong. It was a system that sometimes festered with corruption, prejudice, and fear. Carter stood outside the precinct, watching Terence exit. "Hey," he called softly. Rolling toward Terence in his wheelchair, he'd re-injured his leg during therapy. Terence paused. The two men locked eyes, each carrying invisible scars. Carter extended his hand. "I wish this all had gone differently. You deserved better." Terence stared at the outstretched hand. Part of him wanted to walk away, to bury the memory. But that flicker of hope, he'd always carried that belief in individual worth, urged him to take Carter's hand. The handshake was brief, but it carried more weight than any plaque or ceremony could. In the days that followed, Terence tried to pick up the pieces of his life. The shipping warehouse rehired him, acknowledging the negative press had been a misunderstanding. The community center staff cheered when he returned. Even some local businesses like Harold's Chicken Shack and a Starbucks near 87th Street gave him free meals for a while, recognizing him as that guy who saved the cop. Still, the trauma lingered. At night, he often woke in a cold sweat, haunted by nightmares of assault, handcuffs, and the endless swirl of accusations. Denise Parker's follow-up article delved deeper into the broken trust and raised broader questions about how many others might have been wronged by biased investigations. Terence's story sparked a city-wide conversation about policing, accountability, and what it truly means to serve and protect. Phone calls and letters poured in from strangers, applauding Terence's bravery and perseverance. But the ultimate form of karmic retribution visited the one man who had done everything to destroy. Terence, Officer Timothy Swanson. During the internal affairs investigation, multiple witnesses, including Carter, testified about Swanson's questionable behavior. A string of older complaints surfaced from people who alleged Swanson harassed them or fabricated evidence. Within a few months, Swanson was fired from the Chicago PD. At a subsequent civil trial, he faced legal charges for misconduct. In a grim turn, many of the families that had once been victims of his rogue policing came forward, demanding reparation. Eventually, Swanson lost his house to legal fees and faced the real possibility of jail time for tampering with evidence. Meanwhile, Terence soldiered on, determined not to let bitterness consume him. He still volunteered at the community center, telling the kids a sanitized version of his ordeal, how important it was to stay true to your values, even when things got dark. Some days, the memory of being placed in handcuffs and labeled a suspect nearly suffocated him, but he fought to reclaim the sense of dignity he once held so dear. Time passed, and Officer Carter, no longer able to perform active duty due to complications from his injuries, took on a role in the department's outreach program. He and Terence crossed paths occasionally during events aimed at fostering better police-community relations. Their conversations were respectful, sometimes even warm, but always tinged with the unspoken heaviness of what had transpired. In one poignant moment at a public forum, Carter took the podium and spoke candidly. "I owe my life to Terence Brown," he said, voice cracking. "He saved me without hesitation, even though we'd never met. That selfless act changed my perspective on what it truly means to serve the city of Chicago." There, in front of a hushed audience, Carter offered a heartfelt apology for the wrong Terence had suffered. Terence, seated in the audience, simply nodded, tears burning at the corners of his eyes. As Terence left that forum, he realized something. While the events he endured had scarred him, they had also sparked conversations and reforms. He hadn't intended to become a catalyst for change, but life often thrust unsuspecting souls into that role. And if some good could come of his pain, then perhaps it wasn't in vain. He could have walked away from it all, moved to another city, started fresh. Instead, he decided to stay in Chicago, where the same streets that tried to tear him down also held the promise of healing. He continued to speak at local gatherings, volunteering his story as a cautionary tale of how quickly heroism can turn into suspicion in a fractured society. Over time, a new sense of respect for him grew in the community, one that went beyond local celebrity. He was respected for his moral conviction, for standing strong when everything crumbled around him. In the end, Terence could never completely erase the trauma, but he let it shape him into someone more empathetic, more understanding of the complexities that exist in every corner of the city. The barbed wire of fear and injustice had once trapped him, but now he transformed it into a message of resilience. And as for Officer Daniel Carter, the man who lived because Terence dared to care, he, too, carried this story like a shield, a reminder that not all heroes wear badges and not all illusions of protection are real. Because sometimes the person you least expect to save your life might be the very one the system tries to condemn. And that impossible twist of fate remains as powerful as it is heartbreaking, resonating through the streets of Chicago long after the final gavel fell on the case that could have destroyed Terence Brown forever. Thank you for joining me on this rollercoaster tale of courage, chaos, and the unlikely bond between a man and a cop whose life he saved. Terence Brown showed us that doing the right thing can sometimes lead you into the eye of a storm, but staying true to your principles can help you navigate through to the other side. Officer Carter's story reminds us that genuine gratitude can bridge deep divides, and that everyone deserves a fair chance. If this story moved you, if it made you question the lines between hero and suspect, or reflect on the power of doing good in a complicated world, then I invite you to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to this channel for more thought-provoking stories. Together, let's keep these conversations alive, and let's keep shining a light where it's needed most.